To talk more about Washington's new sanction warning on China over its support for Russia, we sat down with John Sitilides, former U.S. State Department diplomacy consultant and geopolitical strategist at Trilogy Advisors, for insight. John Sitilides, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the U.S. is warning Beijing over its support of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, saying that Beijing could face further sanctions from the U.S. as well as NATO. Now, what is the scale of these likely sanctions? How likely are we to see something similar to what the West slapped on Russia?
It's a very important question that you ask, and there's no sense right now that it'll be anything on the scale of Russia, simply because, for the first reason, the U.S. and Chinese economies are so heavily interdependent and interlinked that any major damage to the Chinese economy, even if the sanctions might be able to accomplish that, and there's a question in and of itself there, would of course redound to economic misery in the United States. And I don't want to say necessarily that it's a distraction from the problems that we face in Ukraine, but there isn't a clear sense that any new sanctions on China, which for the most part is able to plausibly claim that it is adhering to the letter of the sanctions, if not the spirit of the sanctions, is going to do any great damage to U.S. efforts against Russia. So it's very difficult to ascertain what the immediate motivation here is, except to try to shore up what is an increasingly fragile Ukraine policy in Washington.
On that note, a piece in the Wall Street Journal is noting how U.S. sanctions have inadvertently created an axis of evasion led by China, saying the bloc of sanctioned nations collectively now have this economy of scale to shield them from Washington's financial warfare. We're seeing them trade everything from drones to missiles to gold and oil. On that note, why haven't these sanctions had the intended effect?
They can have minimal impact, but especially on countries that are weaker economies that are much more dependent on the United States, on the U.S. and Western-led currency exchange system and foreign exchange systems. But when you're dealing again with a country the size of Russia, which again is the 10th or 11th largest economy in the world, it's not only an energy exporting superpower, but it is a commodity superpower. It is engaged in closer trade ties to China, which now has essentially doubled its trade ties with Russia over the last several years. But also most countries in what we call politely in Washington, the global South, retain very strong trade ties with Russia. They want no part of the U.S. and European sanctions against Moscow. And it's very difficult to effectively wield sanctions against such a large and powerful economy that is so deeply embedded in what is becoming increasingly, it seems, an almost bifurcated global energy market.
Expanding on that, we've also seen communist China helping countries like Russia, but also Iran, especially what we're seeing with Hamas in that war against Israel there. Given all of that, what is the solution here if sanctions aren't having the intended effect?
With China especially, we're increasingly concerned about not only violations of its citizens' human rights and labor standards and environmental standards, but obviously violations of international law and international treaties vis-a-vis Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, and a number of ASEAN countries around the South China Sea region. And it seems to me that more effective approach would be, first of all, military deterrence in order to be able to put guardrails around those countries. But also the fact that, for instance, China has been in the World Trade Organization since 2001, operating with near impunity, even though it has violated almost all of the compliance criteria of WTO membership. And there's been no serious effort to either remove China from the WTO or for Washington to rescind the permanent most favored trading nation status with China, to demonstrate to China and to Russia and to other countries that the U.S. is less concerned about being loved and respected and more about being feared, where we can wield these tools in a very realistic and credible manner.
John Sitilides, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks again for having me.